All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to break down a really provocative and honestly influential analysis of where the West stands in the world today. It's an argument that kind of challenges our whole idea of inevitable progress and asks some pretty tough questions about what the future of global politics actually looks like. So, let's start with this huge question. Do great civilizations even know when they're on the verge of decline? Well, if you look at history, the answer is kinda unsettling. It seems that more often than not, they don't. In fact, the source we're digging into argues that this feeling of permanence, this idea that you've reached the absolute peak of history, is actually one of the biggest red flags of all. And this quote right here, it just gets to the absolute heart of the matter. This idea of a mirage of immortality. I mean, think about it. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, even the British Empire at its height. They all felt like their way was the way, the final, ultimate form of society. But that conviction, that blindness to their own weaknesses, often came right before things started to seriously go down. So to really get a grip on this argument, here's how we're going to walk through it. We'll start with this mirage of immortality idea and what a typical civilization's life cycle looks like. Then we'll dive into the specific threats the West is apparently facing, unpack the dangers of thinking your culture is universal, and finally, look at the proposed rules for a totally new kind of world. Okay, so the whole foundation of this analysis is a model for how civilizations evolve. And the core idea is that throughout history, these great powers tend to follow a surprisingly predictable path, from birth to greatness and eventually to decline. So this idea, which comes from the historian Carol Quigley, lays out this whole life cycle. As you can see, it usually starts with a mixture of different cultures that kind of gels together, and then it starts to expand. After a while, there's an age of conflict, which can lead to a peak, a kind of golden age or universal empire. But, and this is the key part, history shows that this peak is very often followed by a period of decay and ultimately vulnerability. So the big question is, where does the West fit into all of this? Well, according to this argument, we're right there at stage 5, the universal empire phase. You know, a time of relative peace, prosperity, and massive global influence. But the huge warning from this model is that this golden age, it isn't the finish line. Nope. It's more like a summit, and it might be the stage right before the long slide into decay begins. Okay, so if decline is a real possibility, where's the danger coming from? The source argues it's not just one thing, it's a two-front challenge, hitting Western societies from the inside and from the outside world at the same time. Let's break that down. Internally, the argument points to things like moral decline and cultural disunity. We'll get into the specifics in just a sec. And then, externally, at the very same time, you have other civilizations, especially in Asia and the Islamic world, that are just surging with economic power, growing populations, and a new sense of cultural confidence. So you can see how the pressure is coming from both directions. So what does this internal decay actually look like? Well, the source points to a few specific symptoms. Things like rising crime and drug use, the breakdown of family structures, a drop in community trust, what some people call social capital, a weaker work ethic, and falling education standards. The point here is that these aren't just a bunch of random social problems, and I'm sure you recognize a lot of them from the headlines. They're seen as connected signs of a deeper civilizational weakness. Now, this is a really, really critical concept in the whole argument. The claim is that the most immediate, most important conflict for the West isn't with some external enemy. It's happening inside the United States. The source calls this the real clash. It's a battle over what America's identity is. On one side, you have people who want to double down on America's Western heritage, and on the other, you have those pushing for a multicultural identity. The author argues this internal fight is the main event that's going to shape the West's future. All right, let's move on to the next major idea, which is a pretty powerful attack on a core Western belief. The idea that Western values, liberalism, democracy, human rights are universal, and that every society on Earth is eventually going to adopt them. The source argues this belief in universalism is a huge mistake for 3 reasons. First, it's just false. Other civilizations aren't becoming westernized, they're getting modern, for sure, but they're doing it while rediscovering and reasserting their own unique cultures. Second, it's immoral. I mean, trying to force Western values on everyone else is basically a new form of imperialism, which totally goes against the Western value of self-determination. And third, it's dangerous. Pushing this universal idea could cause a huge backlash, leading to a global conflict that the West might not have the power or the will to win. And this quote just nails the alternative view being presented here. The argument is that the West shouldn't be trying to remake other civilizations in its own image, Instead, it should be focused on protecting and renewing what makes it unique, its legacy of individualism, the rule of law, and political pluralism. So given this whole diagnosis, what's the prescription? What are we supposed to do? Well, the final part of the analysis lays out a game plan, a set of rules, not just for the West to survive, but for the entire world to avoid a massive, catastrophic conflict. For the West itself, the advice is basically to look inward, renew its own culture and values, get more unified, and keep its technological and military advantage. But it highlights one rule as the absolute most important. The West has to stop intervening in the internal business of other civilizations. The author argues that this is the single biggest thing that sparks global instability. And building on that point, we get 3 simple rules for global peace. First, the abstention rule. The big powers have to stay out of other civilizations' family feuds. It's not their business. Second, the joint mediation rule. When conflicts do happen between civilizations, the major powers need to work together to mediate and contain them. And third, the commonalities rule. Instead of obsessing over what makes everyone different, all cultures should be actively looking for the values and interests they actually share. So, this all leads us to the final, really powerful conclusion. If the main event isn't a simple showdown between the West and the rest, then what is the ultimate danger facing all of us in this new world? And the answer, according to this analysis, is not a clash of civilizations, but a clash between civilization, with a capital C, and barbarism. The real threat is the breakdown of law and order, the rise of global crime, and just a worldwide decay of the basic things that make societies work. And that's a threat that every single civilization faces. And we'll end with this final thought, which really pulls it all together. When we're facing this common threat, this slide into barbarism, the argument is that the world's great civilizations, for all their differences, have a shared interest in survival. They will either hang together to defend order, morality, and progress, or they will all fall apart separately. It's a pretty powerful warning and a call for a totally new kind of global cooperation.